For Filipinos, the all too familiar term bahala na is a common catch-all phrase that is used to give up a task, or even one's life, to the hands of God. Whether it be an exam one hasn't studied for, or the impending fate of one's health, we use bahala na to express a fatalistic or deterministic attitude towards situations we no longer have control over, running away when all seems lost. But while various literature focuses on its negative connotations, I argue that bahala na can be used responsibly as a middle ground between recklessly charging towards a situation unprepared and failing to decide the outcome of one's actions. So join me as I borrow help from Aristotle to explore how bahala na can display virtuous attributes so as to express an absolute necessity in giving up. Along the way, I'll be pressing next on my slides like this and explaining the topic while my voice speaks in the background through the magic of editing, like I'm talking aloud in my own head. This is a study on bahala na as a virtuous way of giving up, anchored to Aristotelian ethics using three distinct examples of real-world situations that anyone can encounter in their lives. The phrase bahala na has its origins in Filipino religion and is best understood through practical applications in situations when one decides to concede or give up, a common fatalistic attitude. The word is thought to have been derived from the word bathala, which for Filipinos means God. So by expression, bahala na literally means to leave something or someone in the care of God. It's no question that bahala na permeates the daily lives of Filipinos and offers a counterpart to the more Western fatalistic philosophy. But Gripaldo contends that it is only fatalistic insofar as it invokes the consequences of one's actions after a person has already given up. Bahala na also gives us some insight into the concept of powerlessness, in which the phrase can actually become a source of power in dire situations, where one feels very powerless. According to Hong, it allows Filipinos to be reminded of a supreme being, that being God, that they can pull hope from when all seems lost, though this sense of power can only manifest if those who use bahala na gain a sense of agency to change their outcome, as opposed to fatally accepting their current situation without doing anything on their part. Now, because the bahala na phenomenon is difficult to concretely define, it is most understandable when used in practical scenarios. Gripaldo offers 6 varied interpretations for the phrase, and in this report I will use 4 of them. 1 to expound on why the phenomenon is stereotyped as a negative attitude, and 3 to define bahala na in relation to the given examples later on. Here's an intro slide for the definitions part, which at the time of recording I didn't write a script for, but hopefully the actual discussion of meanings will make up for it. The first definition pertains to willful ignorance on a person's part. It's basically saying, whatever, it doesn't matter anyway. This use of bahala na pertains to an oversimplification of a task without consideration for what others may feel. And this is a perfect example of how negatively this phrase is used because it promotes inconsideration and low tolerance for giving effort when it is actually needed. The second definition pertains to the diffusion of worry, either for oneself or for others. It's like saying, ako na bahala dyan, huwag niyo na intindihin. This usage is meant to display efforts in solving a problem that others would have to normally worry about. It evokes a sense of responsibility that will be conducted sometime later on. The third meaning pertains to when a person is left to their own devices, but must be ready for the consequences of their actions. It hands off total responsibility to someone at fault because they cannot be reasoned with anymore, and helping them is futile. Finally, this fourth usage is meant to leave someone alone. In contrast to the third definition above, this one is used when a person has, for the longest time, been so difficult to work with. We aren't telling them to be ready for the consequences of their actions, we're just leaving them because it's the best outcome at the moment for us as free agents. Bahala na has also been linked largely to the concept of fatalism. In a 2013 column piece for Inquirer, journalist Michael Tan wrote about the late Dr. Alfredo Lagmay, a University of the Philippines professor who studied the bahala na phenomenon. Lagmay argued that while bahala na has some links to fatalism, it is inconsistent with the fact that fatalism is a philosophy related to the inevitable, that no one can escape their given fate. But a person who uses bahala na has the following characteristic: that they make a tacit declaration of self-confidence in meeting any future contingency instead of blindly following whatever fate they may have. people contain within themselves hope or faith that the outcome of their actions can still change. For Gripaldo, he also says that Bahala na only evokes resignation to the consequences of one's actions, but the intent is still providential because it carries hope that God will take care of us anyway. Now, Aristotle believed that nature has built into humanity the desire to be virtuous, and in order to become virtuous, we must not think of if the actions themselves are virtuous, but if we ourselves are virtuous people, made possible if we continuously learn how to act appropriately in all situations. In Nicomachean ethics, virtue is concerned with the moral need to build good character, a contrast to other normative ethics that are inclined to ask what people ought to do in each situation. Here's the framework. Actions are called just and temperate when they are such as the just or temperate person would do, and that by doing just acts that the just person is made, basically. In other words, the actions themselves aren't virtuous, they only become virtuous when virtuous people act in accordance to virtue. Without virtuous people, virtuous actions won't exist, and people can only become virtuous through basically trial and error. Now, Aristotle believed that there wasn't any specific way to be virtuous, because a virtuous person would know what to do all the time. He understood virtue as the midpoint between two extremes that anyone can do, what he calls vices. A vice is either a deficiency or excess of an act and must be avoided at all costs. However, the good act in between them isn't always universal, and since what is good for the many has no fixity, the most virtuous option is to go for the center, which is called the golden mean. In doing so, agents must depart from the most erroneous extreme and act according to what is intermediate not in the object, but relatively to us. He also believed that virtues uniquely applied to individual situations are more truthful than, say, general comments about generosity as the virtuous mean between stinginess and prodigality. Virtue exists differently in each situation, and what is an excess or defect to us can be a golden mean for others, and vice versa. Thus, Bahala na invoking fortitude for a specific person in a specific situation signifies courage as the golden mean between rashness and cowardice, but not always. It can take the form of another virtue, another golden mean, or it can take the form of a vice, which is why Bahala na has history of negative usage, as what definition 1 earlier was pertaining to, and positive usage, as what definitions 2 to 4 were pertaining to. So for each situation, Aristotle's method for knowing the three placements are as follows. Statements that are more particular are truer than general statements on virtue, because virtuous conduct has to do with the individual cases, and whatever our actions will be must harmonize with the facts of these cases. For Aristotle, he thinks of acts in particular situations and then he infers the vices that oppose them. Even if some vices don't have specific names, he says that we are fine with having outlines or summaries instead and can still make our conclusions later on. Now in this final section, I'll be applying Aristotle's golden mean in 3 scenarios using Bahala na to assess if it really does have virtuous underpinnings. Situation number 1. Knowing a student won't pass their thesis subject and is only given up to today to withdraw without failing, they decide to do so and says, "Mag-drop na ako, i-retake ko na lang next term, bahala na ako sa sarili ko." Their friends pass the subject, while the student has to retake it again. They feel despondent but hopeful because it's the best possible outcome. Now regarding the use of bahala na, it was used to invoke a sense of responsibility and risk-taking. Its logical excess is recklessness or an excess in responsibility, and the deficiency of responsibility is a lack of decisiveness to decide on time until the deadline for dropping has already passed and they miss their chance. Now, in assessment, a virtuous student would review the situation. If they knew their research was being positively met by the panel and mentor and have good enough reason to believe that they can safely pass, then going through with the subject would have likely become the responsible choice. But if they've been criticized over and over, then they would know that dropping and resetting would simply cover their chance of failing the subject. Working at a local shop as a cashier, they refuse service to an extremely rude customer because they can't give them a reserved last stock item. The cashier says, "Bahala na po kayo dyan. You may talk to our manager, but they will say the exact same thing." And then the cashier leaves. Now, bahala na in this case utilizes definition number 3 and invokes the virtue of courage by leaving an unreasonable customer alone. And while courage can mean many things, Aristotle points out that its use depends on the situation and must harmonize with what's happening. Here, the logical excess of courage is rashness, while the defect is cowardice. Now, a virtuous cashier acting courageously would have known that the customer can't be reasoned with anymore with their power. Had they continued prolonging the argument, the cashier's rash behavior may have led them to say bad things and thus jeopardize their job. But had they cowardly sat there and not called for help, other irritated shoppers would have been deterred, which is contrary to the purpose of the store. But because there is a higher power that can assist them, the cashier decides to call the manager and leave the rude customer alone, acting within their limits because the situation was already outside of their personal control. This last one is a bit more personal. Falling out of love with a partner you've been with for over 2 years, you end the relationship because they've been very toxic, as in really, really toxic. You say, "We're done. Bahala ka na dyan sa buhay mo. I don't deserve this kind of treatment anymore." Virtue ethics would tell us to act appropriately and avoid exceeding both hurting someone deliberately for revenge and allowing oneself to be continuously hurt. Here, Bahala na uses definition 4, which frees oneself from an intolerable amount of pain that is consciously being given by someone else. The virtuous choice is to simply leave the relationship because A, the other person's character isn't so easily changeable, and B, the one hurt has already suffered as much. Now, by leaving and moving on, we manage to avoid any harsh arguments that could damage both parties further, or prolonging the suffering by staying in the relationship and needlessly tolerating the partner for longer. Now, in assessment, Aristotle stresses that while it's not easy to find the golden mean in most situations, we must always depart from what is most contrary to it. Saying "bahala ka na" as a way to give up steers from what is most contrary to giving up, and that is having an excessive tolerance for the abuse one is experiencing. Therefore, it is virtuous, in the Aristotelian sense, to move on from suffering that cannot be so easily extinguished, especially if one has had enough of it. Bahala na has permeated Filipino culture in many ways, in part due to its presence as a wide solution to problems outside of our control, but with which we've done everything we can to deal with them until they're no longer feasible. It has virtuous underpinnings that are visible when used as a middle ground between harsher and more unfavorable solutions. And because there are multiple positive and negative uses to Bahala na, we're better off departing from the negative ones and sticking to the positive ones. Now, the way to tell how Bahala na is being used virtually and responsibly is by assessing if giving up truly is the optimum solution at the time, but only after we've done everything we could and leaving the rest up to our faith. It seems to me that Bahala na will remain an integral part of our decision making as Filipinos, and will stay with us for as long as its practical applications benefit our well-being. I'm Diego Valencia, and this encapsulates my time here at PLM Philly. I would like to dedicate this final paper and report to my friends in class, Joseph Beltrano, Aisha Lim, and Kurt Tubera, who've been of great help and kindness to me throughout the course of the term. I would also like to thank my professor, Dr. Beverly Sarza, for welcoming me into her course and department and teaching me all about Filipino philosophy. And lastly, I would like to especially thank my partner, Romel Liboro, who has always been there for me since the start. Thank you to everyone and see you all around campus.